Imagine, imagine the most powerful CEO in the world.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So picture them walking into this like high-stakes boardroom, completely ignoring the leather chair at the head of the table,
Naturally.
taking off their suit jacket, getting down on their knees, and actually physically washing the dirt off the shoes of their summer interns.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds absolutely insane.
It really does, right? I mean, in a modern corporate environment, that kind of behavior would probably trigger like an immediate vote of no confidence from the board.
Oh, without a doubt. They'd think the CEO had lost their mind.
Exactly. But according to the manuscript we are diving into today, that exact staggering inversion of power might actually be the only way to build an indestructible leadership legacy.
It is a profound image, and it completely shatters the fundamental assumptions most of us hold about how authority is supposed to work.
Yeah,
We're conditioned to believe that power is something you accumulate and protect. The higher you go, the more insulated you become.
right, right. Well, welcome to a brand new deep dive. Today, our mission is to completely deconstruct and then rebuild your entire understanding of leadership.
It's a big task.
It is. We are looking at a really comprehensive manuscript titled Servant Leadership, Leading with Humility and Integrity.
And the core thesis of this text is what the author calls this radical kingdom reversal.
A kingdom reversal.
Yeah, it's the argument that the path to true sustainable greatness isn't about climbing a ladder to look down on people. It's about descending.
Descending.
Right. It's about holding the towel, so to speak.
Which is an incredibly difficult concept to swallow if you are operating in today's professional landscape.
Oh, absolutely. The messaging we receive almost from birth is just relentless.
It really is. Like, if you are listening to this right now, think about the advice you've been given throughout your entire career. You are constantly bombarded with this idea that leadership is entirely about visibility.
You have to assert control.
Yes. You have to aggressively protect your status. You need to build your personal brand, right?
Yeah.
And you definitely need to make sure you are the loudest, most authoritative voice in the room.
Because the implicit threat is always there, isn't it? If you aren't actively claiming your space and defending your turf.
Someone else is going to take it from you.
Exactly. But the manuscript we are analyzing today argues that this exact model, the one we are all implicitly taught to follow, is actually a trap.
A trap. Wow.
Yeah, the text presents this fascinating tension. The author argues that the very qualities modern society tends to dismiss as soft or,
With
weak.
humility.
Right. Humility, self-emptying, moral consistency, and a relentless focus on serving others. The author says these are, in reality, the most rigorous and indestructible forms of power a human being can possess.
That's a massive claim.
It is. The source material insists these are not just optional soft skills for a nice work environment. They are the fundamental architectural bedrock of any influence that actually lasts.
Okay, so that brings us to the first major conceptual hurdle in the text. The author draws a massive, unignorable line in the sand between two competing systems of logic.
Empire logic and kingdom logic.
Exactly. And the text argues that you cannot blend them. You are either operating in one or the other. So let's look at the default setting first. The manuscript describes empire logic as the way the world naturally operates.
Yes, it frames empire logic as the default operating system of human history. It is a system that actively rewards the self-made, the self-assertive, and the self-protective.
Right.
In the empire framework, influence is used to justify authority, and distance is used to reinforce power.
Distance. That makes so much sense. Think about how traditional corporate hierarchies or even political structures work. The higher you ascend, the less accessible you become.
Exactly.
The executive suite is physically separated, often requiring key cards and special security clearances just to access the floor.
Yeah, in this system, leadership is primarily a mechanism of elevation. You rise above others, and you maintain that elevated position through mechanisms of control and dominance.
The visual that immediately comes to mind when reading that section is that old playground game, King of the Hill.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
You fight your way to the top of the dirt mound, and your entire job, once you get up there, is to actively push everyone else down so you can maintain your position.
Right. It's a zero-sum game. Your success inherently requires someone else's failure.
Which is combative, it is exhausting, and it just breeds paranoia.
Completely.
But then the text introduces kingdom logic, which operates on a complete inversion of that physics. In the biblical framework the author lays out, greatness is defined exclusively by service.
And authority is expressed through sacrifice.
Right. And to illustrate this clash of logics, The manuscript points to a very specific, pivotal moment in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10.
Yeah, it's an incident involving two of Jesus's closest disciples, James and John. The text uses this narrative as a masterclass in exposing the hidden assumptions we all carry about power.
It's a wildly uncomfortable story, honestly.
It really is.
James and John pull Jesus aside, and they essentially ask for the seats of honor in his coming administration. They want one on his right and one on his left.
In modern terms, they are asking for the executive vice president slots.
Yes, they are angling for proximity to power. They want the corner offices.
Exactly. The manuscript points out that they are operating entirely on empire thinking. They believe they are negotiating a promotion based on their loyalty.
Which is so funny when you think about it.
Right, but what's equally revealing is the reaction of the other 10 disciples. When they find out what James and John did, they become furious.
Naturally.
But the text makes a brilliant observation here. The other disciples aren't angry because they disagree with the premise of the request.
Oh, right.
They are angry because James and John beat them to the punch. They all wanted those seats.
They were all playing King of the Hill.
Exactly.
The entire group's imagination is completely captured by the empire's definition of success. And the way the manuscript describes Jesus' response is fascinating. He doesn't just, pull them into a seminar on emotional intelligence.
Or offer a slight course correction on their management style.
Right. The author notes that he severs them from the worldly paradigm completely. He points out how the rulers of the Gentiles, the leaders of the empire, lorded over people, using their authority to dominate.
And then he drops 4 words that the text argues permanently alter the definition of leadership.
Not so with you.
Not so with you. The manuscript highlights this as a categorical, non-negotiable distinction.
The hard stop.
Yeah. According to the text, Jesus replaces the concept of domination with what scholars call the ransom motif.
The ransom motif.
Right. He tells them that whoever wants to become great must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. He then points to himself as the ultimate standard,
stating that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Exactly. The text argues that this fundamentally reframes leadership from an act of acquisition to a redemptive self-giving act.
So if the empire is king of the hill, the kingdom logic described here is more like being the foundation of a skyscraper.
Oh, I like that.
Instead of scrambling to the top, you go down deep into the dirt. You willingly carry the immense crushing weight of the entire structure so that the building above you and all the people inside it can reach the sky.
Right.
Nobody ever sees the foundation. It doesn't get a plaque. But without it, the whole thing collapses under its own weight.
The foundation analogy captures the essence of the manuscript's argument perfectly. It highlights the invisible, weight-bearing nature of true support.
Yeah.
But the text also uses the story of James and John to issue a very stark warning for anyone trying to lead well today. Think about it. James and John were as close to the source of this teaching as humanly possible.
They were in the inner circle.
They had proximity to the ultimate truth. Yet when it came to their baseline assumptions about power and status, they still defaulted to the empire.
That is a terrifying reality to confront.
It really is.
It proves that just being in the room where good values are discussed doesn't automatically change your internal hardwiring.
Precisely. The author extrapolates this to the modern listener. You know, you can operate inside a morally driven nonprofit, a religious institution, or a highly ethical corporation with a beautiful mission statement on the wall.
And still be deeply infected by empire assumptions.
Exactly. You might still be quietly protecting your turf, managing your image, and, stepping on your colleagues to ensure you get the credit for a successful project.
Which begs the obvious question. If the gravitational pull of the empire is that strong, how do we actually escape it?
Right.
Because according to the manuscript, to truly grasp this kingdom reversal, we can't just read another book on human organizational theory. We have to look past human strategies altogether.
The author argues that we have to examine the ultimate source of this leadership model,
which requires diving into theology and the nature of God himself.
The manuscript makes a very bold philosophical claim here. It says, true leadership doesn't begin with sociology or business administration. It begins with theology.
Okay.
The text asserts that if you want to understand how to lead, you have to look at how God leads. And the startling revelation of the biblical narrative, according to the author, is that God is the first servant.
See, I have to pause there because calling the omnipotent creator of the universe a servant feels like a massive contradiction in terms.
It does sound counterintuitive.
Yeah. When most people think of the concept of God, they think of the ultimate king, the sovereign, untouchable ruler who dictates reality from a distance.
That is the common perception, yes.
Hmm.
But the manuscript meticulously breaks down how that sovereignty is actually exercised throughout the biblical text.
Okay.
The author argues that God never leads from a detached, isolated distance. He leads through intimate, self-giving involvement. The text starts by looking at the Old Testament to establish this pattern. Take the creation narrative in Genesis.
Right.
The author argues that creation wasn't just a sudden flex of raw, egotistical power to show off. It was an act of profound, generous service.
How so?
Well, the text frames God as preparing a meticulously ordered garden, organizing chaos into a habitat designed specifically for humanity to flourish. He provided the environment before humanity even existed to ask for it.
Ah, okay. And the text traces that same pattern into the story of the Exodus.
Yes.
You have Egypt, which
Yeah.
is the ultimate superpower of the ancient world, and they're dominating an enslaved population. That's peak empire logic.
Mercury.
And the manuscript points out that God uses his supreme, unmatched power not to conquer another nation for the sake of expanding his own ego, but to liberate the oppressed. He uses power to break chains, not forge them.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Even looking at a figure like Abraham. The text notes that Abraham wasn't chosen by God so he could sit on a throne, hoard wealth, and boast about his elite status. He was chosen to be a conduit.
Right.
The famous promise is that he was blessed so that he could be a blessing to all nations. The focus of the power is entirely outward.
That outward focus is the defining characteristic. The manuscript points out that in God's economy, power is never self-referential.
Oh.
It is never about proving how strong you are or securing your own safety. It is always oriented toward the other. The text argues that biblical authority is deeply relational, not dominative.
Relational, not dominative.
Yes. This is why the concept of a covenant is so central to the theology. A covenant is not a contract where you extract value from someone else.
It's not transactional.
Right. It is a profound commitment where you willingly take on responsibility for the well-being of the other party.
Which logically leads to a massive question, one that challenges our most basic assumptions about how power should work. If you're reading this text, you have to ask, if God has ultimate, sovereign, completely unchecked power, why doesn't he just dictate everything?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Why doesn't he just snap his fingers, force perfect compliance, and avoid all the mess? Why choose this incredibly painful, frustrating path of making covenants and constantly bearing the burdens of a rebellious, flawed humanity?
The manuscript addresses that tension directly. It argues that forced compliance is the tool of a dictator, not a loving creator.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Forced compliance produces robots, whereas relational burden-bearing produces genuine transformation and voluntary love.
That makes a lot of sense.
To illustrate this humanly, the text points to Moses as the ultimate archetype of the burden-bearing leader in the Old Testament. Moses isn't depicted sitting in a comfortable palace issuing decrees.
No, he's in the wilderness.
Exactly. He is constantly out in the dirt, standing in the gap between God and a very difficult, terrified, and complaining group of people.
He acts as an intercessor.
Yes.
The text really emphasizes the emotional and physical toll this took on Moses. When the people fail, Moses doesn't just wash his hands of them and say, well, they ruined it.
Right.
He steps into the breach and pleads for their survival. He proves the manuscript's point that a true leader acts as a shock absorber for their people.
I love that phrase.
Yeah, they take the hits, they smooth out the road, they don't act as a dictator, lording their positional authority over the very people they're supposed to protect.
Shock absorber is a highly accurate way to translate the text's view of intercession. A leader absorbs the friction and the anxiety of the system so the people don't have to.
Yeah.
And the manuscript argues that this divine pattern of relational serving authority doesn't peak with Moses, it accelerates. The author traces this trajectory to its ultimate shocking climax in the New Testament with a theological concept known as kenosis.
Kenosis. This is the section of the manuscript where the physics of leadership completely invert.
They really do.
The author focuses heavily on the second chapter of Philippians, which contains a passage scholars refer to as the Christ hymn, and the defining concept of this hymn is self-emptying.
Right, the Greek word is kenosis.
The text explains that Jesus didn't cling to his divine privilege or use it as a shield, but instead took the form of a servant, submitting to the ultimate vulnerability of the cross.
Yeah.
The author breaks this down into a blueprint of 5 distinct movements of descent.
The manuscript treats these 5 movements as the ultimate template for authentic leadership. The first movement the text identifies is equality with God.
Oh.
It argues that Christ begins in the highest position imaginable. This is crucial for the author's argument because it proves his humility isn't born out of weakness or a lack of options. He is completely secure in his identity and power.
Got it. So he's not forced into it.
Exactly. The second movement is the refusal to exploit privilege. The text notes that he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or used to his own advantage. He possessed ultimate power, but actively refused to leverage it for self-preservation.
Let me jump in there because that second movement is the exact opposite of modern corporate instinct.
Oh, completely.
The second we get a puck, a title, a corner office, or access to the corporate jet, our immediate instinct is to leverage it to get even more. We use privilege to insulate ourselves from the grind.
Exactly, which is why the text presents this as such a radical disruption.
Hmm.
The third movement the author outlines is the actual self-emptying, the kenosis itself. The scripture says he made himself nothing. The manuscript is careful to clarify that this doesn't mean he lost his divine identity. Rather, he completely surrendered his divine entitlement.
He laid aside the rights and privileges of his position.
Right. The fourth movement is taking the form of a servant. He willingly enters the brutal limitations of the human experience. He doesn't just play the role of a servant as a PR stunt, the text argues. He actually becomes one.
And finally, the fifth movement is obedience to death. It is the ultimate expression of total surrender and love, culminating in a public execution on a Roman cross.
Yes, that's the complete descent.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this on behalf of every listener currently navigating a highly competitive environment.
I figured you might.
Because this blueprint, emptying yourself, surrendering your entitlements, refusing to exploit your advantages, it sounds incredibly noble in a theology book. But in a cutthroat corporate culture, it sounds like a masterclass in how to get completely destroyed.
It does sound like professional suicide.
Exactly. If I walk into the boardroom tomorrow and empty myself of my positional authority, someone else is just going to take my budget, poach my team, and take credit for my work. Does the manuscript actually expect leaders to embrace weakness? Doesn't that mean giving up your ability to actually get things done and protect your people?
The manuscript anticipates that exact fear. It acknowledges that kenosis feels incredibly dangerous because it violates every instinct of self-preservation we have.
Right.
But the text argues that this is the central paradox of kingdom leadership. The author quotes the Apostle Paul, who records God telling him, "My power is made perfect in weakness."
Made perfect in weakness.
Yeah. The manuscript's thesis is that constantly fighting to protect your ego and project an image of invulnerability actually alienates people.
Okay, that's true.
But admitting your limitations and refusing to leverage your power for selfish gain creates a profound psychological safety. It invites genuine collaboration, it invites grace, and it builds a level of authentic trust that authoritarianism can never achieve.
The text uses the cross itself to illustrate this redefinition of power. To the Roman Empire, the ultimate symbol of worldly dominance, the cross looked like the ultimate defeat.
Completely.
It was designed to be a public display of total humiliation and powerlessness. But the manuscript argues that the cross was actually the ultimate victory. It achieved a redemptive outcome that no Roman legion ever could.
The author is arguing for a complete redefinition of what winning actually looks like.
Yeah.
And to further ground this, the text contrasts the worldly obsession with rank and status with the famous scene at the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, chapter 13.
The foot washing.
Yes. The manuscript paints a vivid picture of the cultural context here. First-century society was absolutely obsessed with status. Who sits where at a dinner, who is served first, who has to wash the dust off of whose feet. These social hierarchies were rigidly defined and fiercely protected.
And the text points out that Jesus, the one person in the room who possesses actual unquestionable authority, completely short-circuits their status game.
He totally flips the script.
He stands up, takes off his outer clothing, grabs a towel and a basin of water, and starts doing the job of the lowest servant in the household. He washes the dirt and manure off his disciples' feet.
It's stunning.
The author argues that this act doesn't diminish his authority as their leader. It completely authenticates it.
The manuscript uses that scene to prove a vital point. If your authority is genuine and grounded in service, you don't need to anxiously protect it.
Right.
But the text also makes it clear that the internal posture required to actually hold that towel and basin, to willingly take the lowest position for the sake of someone else's dignity, requires a specific virtue.
Which is
A virtue, the author believes, is the most misunderstood concept in the modern world: humility.
the manuscript section on decoding humility is fascinating because I think a lot of people hear the word humility and they immediately picture like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh.
Yes, exactly.
They imagine someone moping around, staring at the floor, saying, "Oh, I'm nobody. I'm terrible. Don't look at me. My ideas are
A
bad."
woe is me routine.
Right. But the source text aggressively attacks that definition. It states clearly that humility is not self-hatred, is not passivity, it is not having a low opinion of your skills, and it is definitely not timidity.
Not at all.
The author defines humility as accurate self-awareness before God and strength under submission. There is a specific quote in the text that really crystallizes this. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less often and more rightly.
That is the crux of the manuscript's definition. To support this, the author points to the Apostle Paul's instruction in Romans 12.3, where he tells people to think of themselves with sober judgment.
Sober judgment.
The text interprets this as an accurate, unfiltered self-perception. According to this framework, a truly humble leader knows exactly what their gifts are, and they know exactly where they are incompetent.
They don't pretend.
Right.
Yeah.
They don't engage in false modesty, pretending to be bad at something they are genuinely brilliant at. That's just another form of ego.
Because their core identity is anchored in something transcendent,
Yeah.
rather than in their quarterly performance review or their job title, they don't have to constantly perform.
Exactly.
They are freed from the exhausting treadmill of posturing and protecting a fragile ego.
The manuscript argues that this internal security is what allows a leader to genuinely elevate others. The author brings up the historical figure of Nehemiah as a prime case study in this.
Oh, Nehemiah.
Yeah, Nehemiah served as the cupbearer to the king of Persia. In that ancient context, he had immense political access, immense wealth, and elite status.
He was at the top of the food chain.
He was. When he receives permission to go rebuild the ruined walls of Jerusalem, he doesn't arrive, set up a silk command tent, and just bark orders at the locals while drinking imported wine.
Which he could have done.
He absolutely could have. But the text highlights that Nehemiah assesses the devastating reality. He prays, and then he gets his hands dirty. He works the stone and mortar right alongside the laborers.
Wow.
He possessed elite status, but the manuscript points out he completely refused to use that status to avoid the heavy, exhausting lifting.
The text also contrasts that highly visible leadership with the quiet humility of Barnabas in the New Testament.
Yes.
Barnabas sells a valuable piece of property and brings the funds to the apostles to help support the impoverished early church. But the author emphasizes what Barnabas didn't do.
Right, what he left out.
He didn't issue a press release. He didn't demand a plaque with his name on the new community center. He saw a critical need, he met it, and he actively avoided the spotlight.
And the manuscript makes a really compelling extrapolation here regarding modern leadership dynamics. This specific brand of secure humility is the only thing that actually generates trust.
And the text asserts that trust is the absolute currency of influence.
It is.
Without trust, a leader doesn't have actual influence, they just have forced compliance.
Exactly. The manuscript argues that a humble leader naturally generates trust because they are inherently teachable. The author uses King Solomon as an example.
Oh, when he asks for wisdom.
Right. When Solomon is offered literally anything by God, he asks for wisdom, openly acknowledging his own youth and inadequacy to lead a nation.
He admitted he didn't know everything.
Yes. The text argues that a humble leader is also secure enough to celebrate when a team member hits a home run, rather than feeling paranoid that their subordinate is getting too much attention and might take their job.
That makes total sense. But, and the manuscript pivots hard on this point. Humility alone isn't enough to survive the pressures of leadership.
No, it's not.
Humility might be the posture of a servant leader, but if you don't have a rigid, unbreakable backbone, the sheer weight of responsibility will crush you. And according to the deep dive we are doing into this text today, that necessary backbone is integrity.
The author views integrity as the necessary architecture of influence, particularly when a leader enters the crucible of crisis.
Right.
The manuscript makes a profound distinction here. It argues that modern society defines integrity merely as the avoidance of scandal, just staying out of the headlines and not getting caught doing something illegal.
The bare minimum.
Exactly. But the text defines integrity as wholeness, the seamless, unbreakable alignment of a person's internal belief, their private character, and their public action.
Wholeness. I like that word.
The author frames integrity as the answer to the ultimate leadership question. Who are you when no one is clapping, and when the pressure to compromise is immense?
To make this actionable, the manuscript unpacks 4 specific pillars of integrity. And this section serves as a really intense diagnostic tool for the reader. The first pillar the author identifies is consistency.
Consistency.
This is defined as aligning your words and actions across all contexts, regardless of your audience. The text points to the life of Joseph in the Old Testament to illustrate this.
Joseph is a fascinating case study for the author. The text traces his brutal trajectory. He is betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery in Potiphar's house, falsely accused of assault, and thrown into a forgotten dungeon for years,
Just one awful thing after another.
before eventually rising to become the second in command over all of Egypt. The manuscript argues that the defining characteristic of Joseph wasn't his administrative brilliance, but his consistency.
Right.
Whether he was a powerless slave and abused prisoner, or the most powerful executive in the empire, his moral character and his reliance on God never fluctuated. The author uses him to prove that integrity cannot be situational.
The second pillar the text outlines is conviction. This is defined as the willingness to prioritize absolute truth over your own convenience, comfort, or safety.
And the manuscript looks at Daniel in Babylon for this.
Yeah. Daniel is a captive, ripped from his homeland and forced into a hostile foreign empire. He is offered a place in the elite training program and given the king's rich food.
Right.
The author points out how incredibly easy and logical it would have been for Daniel to just assimilate, eat the food, blend in, and survive. But he refused because he was anchored to a higher dietary and moral law. He risked his position for his conviction.
The third pillar is transparency. The manuscript defines this as the courage to be accountable and to openly admit your struggles.
Okay, transparency.
The author highlights the Apostle Paul's writings, specifically in 2 Corinthians, as the gold standard for this. Paul doesn't try to project a flawless superhero image to his followers.
He's actually really open about his problems.
He is. He writes openly about his deep hardships, his moments of crushing despair, and his mysterious thorn in the flesh. The text argues that by inviting people into his weakness, Paul paradoxically cemented his authority and their trust.
Which is the exact opposite of the never let them see you sweat advice most leaders get today.
Completely opposite.
And finally, the fourth pillar is courage. The text defines this as standing firm under lethal pressure. Queen Esther is the author's ultimate example here.
Oh, her story is incredible.
It is. She possessed the highest level of comfort and security as the queen, but she risked her own execution by approaching the king uninvited in order to save her people from genocide.
Right.
Her famous quote, "If I perish, I perish," is framed by the text as the ultimate expression of integrity outweighing self-preservation.
The manuscript asserts that when you combine those 4 pillars, consistency, conviction, transparency, and courage, you create an internal structure that can withstand almost unimaginable external pressure.
The best analogy I can think of for how the text describes this is the rebar hidden inside a massive concrete pillar.
Oh, that's a great image.
Right. When you walk past a beautiful modern skyscraper, you don't see the rebar. You just see the polished concrete and the reflective glass. And on a normal sunny day, the concrete seems perfectly strong on its own.
Sure.
But the text argues that leadership is never just a sunny day. The moment a hurricane hits or an earthquake creates violent sheer force, the concrete alone will crack and fail. That hidden, ugly, invisible steel rebar buried deep inside is the only thing keeping the roof from collapsing on everyone's head.
The rebar analogy aligns perfectly with the manuscript's concept of the tension test.
The tension test.
Yeah. The author argues that integrity is not formed in comfort. It is forged and revealed exclusively in tension. The text states that a leader's integrity is tested the most when compromise is socially or financially rewarded and when obedience to their values is incredibly costly.
The text goes back to Daniel to prove this point. When the royal decree goes out that no one in the empire can pray to any god except the king for 30 days, Daniel is faced with a massive tension test.
He really is.
And the manuscript points out what Daniel didn't do. He didn't organize a massive protest. He didn't write an angry letter to the editor or try to incite a riot against the corrupt system.
Right.
He just went to his upper room, opened his windows toward Jerusalem, and quietly got down on his knees and prayed 3 times a day, just as he always had.
The author uses Daniel's quiet defiance to prove a major thesis. You can possess massive, nation-shifting influence inside a deeply corrupt, empire-driven system without compromising your own soul.
Wow.
You don't have to adopt the empire's tactics to survive in the empire.
So we have to look at what this all means when we put the pieces together. What happens when you combine this kind of unbending, rebar-level integrity and this towel and basin humility with actual positional power?
That's where things get interesting.
Yeah, the source material provides a very specific leadership equation to explain this dynamic, and I think this is where the theory hits the pavement for the listener.
The manuscript relies on a mathematical contrast to explain the outcomes of leadership based on the presence or absence of humility. The text lays out this formula. Authority minus humility equals control.
Authority minus humility equals control. Okay.
Conversely, authority plus humility equals transformation. The author elaborates on this by stating that influence without humility inevitably devolves into manipulation, whereas influence coupled with humility becomes true service.
Let's break down the dark side of that equation first. Authority minus humility equals control. The text explores how authority, when stripped of humility, rapidly devolves into authoritarianism and paranoia.
It's a very fast downward spiral.
If a leader lacks the internal security of humility, they have to rely on fear, intimidation, and micromanagement to enforce compliance. And the manuscript concedes that this tactic might actually produce short-term results, like you might hit your quarterly numbers through fear.
But it fractures the organizational culture.
Yes, and completely destroys trust over the long haul. The author uses the biblical narrative of King Saul as the ultimate cautionary tale for this.
Saul is framed by the text as a profoundly tragic figure. The manuscript notes that he actually started his reign with a degree of humility. He was literally hiding among the baggage when he was selected as king.
He didn't even want the job.
Right. But once he accumulated power, because he lacked the inner wholeness of integrity, he became deeply insecure. The author details how Saul began manipulating people to maintain his grip.
Paranoia set in.
Yes, he became violently paranoid about the success and rising popularity of his young subordinate, David. Instead of mentoring David, Saul spent his energy trying to eliminate his rival to protect his fragile ego.
To the point of literally throwing spears at the guy who was playing the harp to soothe.
Exactly.
Throwing a spear at your most talented employee is the ultimate toxic boss scenario.
It really is.
It's the ancient equivalent of sabotaging a rising star in your department because you are terrified they might replace you. The text contrasts Saul's paranoia with the approach of the Apostle Paul.
Oh, yes.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul writes about becoming all things to all people. He willfully adapts his cultural approach depending on his audience. Now, the manuscript points out a crucial nuance here.
Right, because context matters.
If you adapt your personality without humility, that is just manipulation. You are just wearing a mask to extract what you want out of people.
Yep.
But the text argues Paul is doing this not for personal gain, but to serve them, to remove unnecessary barriers, and to bring them to the truth.
The author frames this as the fundamental difference in intent. The empire uses people as tools to build the leader's empire. The kingdom uses the leader's power as a tool to build the people.
I want to pause and address the listener directly here, because the manuscript gets very practical at this stage. If you are listening to this, and you are having a sudden realization that you are on the wrong side of this equation.
Which is a tough realization.
It is. If you are realizing, oh man, I've been relying on control instead of transformation, I've been white-knuckling the steering wheel of my department or my family, how does the text say you start relinquishing that grip? How do you let go without the whole system falling apart?
The manuscript argues that the transition begins with a massive cognitive shift regarding how you view your position. The author introduces the theological concept of stewardship.
Stewardship.
The argument is simple. If you believe you own your power, your title, or your team, you will fight to the death to protect it, just like Saul.
Right.
But if you view your position as a stewardship, which the text defines using Psalm 8, as something temporarily entrusted to you by God to care for others, your posture changes completely. The author insists you do not own the people you lead, you are merely stewarding them for a season.
The text provides historical evidence for how hard it is to actually steward power. It looks at Moses again. Moses was completely exhausted, sitting from morning until night judging every minor dispute for hundreds of thousands of people.
He was trying to do it all himself.
He was burning out. And worse, he was creating a massive bottleneck that was hurting the people he was trying to serve. The manuscript highlights the intervention of his father-in-law, Jethro.
Jethro gives some great advice.
He does. Jethro pulls the leader of the nation aside and bluntly tells him, what you are doing is not good. You're going to wear yourself out. Jethro advises Moses to delegate his authority to empower capable leaders over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens.
The manuscript uses the Moses and Jethro narrative to prove that stewarding authority means you have to actively release it.
Have to let go.
Right. Moses had to relinquish the ego-striking reality of being the only man with the answers in order to multiply his actual impact. The text argues that a leader must actively ask, what must I release so that others can rise?
Wow.
And what rights am I stubbornly clinging to that Christ willingly surrendered?
And to help you actually implement this massive, terrifying paradigm shift, the source material doesn't just leave us floating in high-minded theological concepts.
Right.
The final section of the manuscript offers a highly practical daily toolkit. It outlines specific guardrails designed to operationalize servant leadership in the real world. Let's dig into these tools, starting with what the author calls the decision filter.
The decision filter is presented as a cognitive speed bump. It's a way for a leader to pause and interrogate their own motives before making a significant call.
Okay.
The manuscript outlines 3 specific questions. Number 1, is this decision aligned with Scripture and truth? This establishes a non-negotiable moral baseline.
Right.
Number 2, does this choice honor God, or is it just stroking my own ego? The author argues this question targets the hidden motivations that empire logic thrives on.
That's a tough mirror to look into.
It is. And number 3, would I make this exact same choice if I knew for an absolute fact that no one would ever know about it?
Oof. That third question is brutal.
It really is.
It directly targets the unseen standard of integrity we discussed with the rebar analogy. If you only do the right thing when there is an audience to applaud you, the text argues you don't have integrity, you just have good PR.
Exactly. Good PR is an integrity.
The next tool in the manuscript's toolkit is a practice called listening leadership. This sounds deceptively simple, but the text acknowledges it is incredibly hard to execute.
Oh, it's so hard.
It defines it as the disciplined practice of delaying your opinion. Specifically, the author suggests a rule of waiting a full 3 to 5 seconds after someone stops speaking before you respond. Just sitting in the silence, not interrupting, and not formulating your rebuttal while they're talking.
The manuscript notes that this 3 to 5 second delay is practically agonizing for most modern leaders.
We want to jump right in.
Right, because we are culturally conditioned to believe that leadership means having the right answer instantly. But the author argues that when you constantly interrupt or speak immediately, you implicitly communicate that your voice is inherently more valuable than their insight. The text frames listening leadership as the active delaying of your ego in order to gain collective wisdom. Again, the author points back to Moses listening to Jethro as the prime biblical example.
The guy talking directly to God still listened to his father-in-law.
Exactly. The leader who spoke directly to God still paused to take organizational advice.
The third part of this operational toolkit is something the text calls diagnosing vulnerabilities. The author argues that a leader cannot just assume they're immune to empire logic. You have to proactively map your own psychological pressure points.
You have to know your weaknesses.
You have to sit down and honestly ask yourself, what specific fears drive my worst behavior? When do I prioritize the approval of my board, my peers, or my shareholders over the actual truth?
Yeah.
The manuscript warns that if you don't map your own minefield, you are inevitably going to step on a mine. And that mapping process leads directly into the final exercise the text recommends, which is my favorite part of the book, the weekly integrity goal.
The manuscript frames the weekly integrity goal as a way to build the muscle of integrity incrementally, recognizing that transformation doesn't happen overnight.
I really want to break this exercise down for the listener, because you can literally start doing this the minute this deep dive ends. The text says the exercise works like this. You look at your mapped vulnerabilities, and you pick one specific challenge for the week.
Just one.
Let's say your vulnerability is that you have a terrible habit of avoiding hard conversations because you are a people pleaser and you hate conflict. Okay, you've identified it. Next, you set one highly specific, measurable goal.
Make it concrete.
You say, I am going to have that difficult, honest feedback conversation with Sarah by Thursday at 2 p.m. You put it on the calendar. But the text adds a critical kicker, which is the most important part of the entire process. You have to tell an accountability partner what your specific goal is.
And the manuscript is adamant that this accountability partner is essential for survival.
Why is that?
To prove why, The author highlights a stunning moment in Galatians chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul publicly confronts the Apostle Peter. The text sets the stage. Peter is one of the foundational pillars of the early Christian church. He walked with Jesus.
He's a legend.
Right. Yet the manuscript points out that Peter started acting hypocritically, refusing to eat with Gentile believers because he was afraid of the social backlash from a strict group of Jewish believers.
Oh, wow.
He succumbed to peer pressure and compromised his convictions to protect his image.
He went back to empire logic.
Exactly, and the text shows Paul calling him out on it directly. The author's lesson here is vital. Even the greatest, most spiritually mature leaders experience moral drift. No one is immune to the pull of the empire.
Yeah.
Therefore, the manuscript argues you desperately need someone in your life who loves you enough and who is secure enough in their own identity to look you in the eye and tell you when you are dead wrong.
If the Apostle Peter needed a peer to call him out and keep him honest, you and I definitely need accountability. Okay, let's pull back and synthesize everything we've covered on this intense journey today. Our mission was to deconstruct the typical worldly view of leadership.
And rebuild it.
Right. Through the lens of this manuscript, we've explored the argument that true leadership isn't about ascending to a throne and playing king of the hill. It's about the kingdom reversal of descending, picking up the towel in the basin, and becoming the invisible foundation that supports everyone else.
Yeah.
We examined the source material's theological premise of God as the first servant, who uses supreme power to liberate rather than dominate. We discussed the hidden, indestructible strength of accurate humility, thinking of yourself less often.
Less often and more rightly.
Yes, we
Yeah,
broke
right.
down the unbreakable rebar architecture of integrity, being the exact same person in the dark as you are in the spotlight. And we walked through the practical daily tools required to ensure your authority leads to transformation, rather than manipulation and control.
The manuscript presents a comprehensive, systematic overturning of the empire's logic from the inside out.
And it brings all of this theory right back to you, the listener. The text makes it clear that whether you are managing a massive corporate division with thousands of employees, whether you are volunteering to run a local charity, or whether you are simply trying to guide your family through a really tough season, you are standing directly on the fault line of two competing kingdoms.
You have to choose.
The manuscript argues that you have a daily choice. You can choose the empire's exhausting paranoid path of constantly protecting your image, hoarding your privilege, and enforcing control. Or you can choose the freeing, although incredibly demanding, kingdom path of self-emptying, stewarding your responsibility, and genuinely serving the people entrusted to your care.
As we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on what the manuscript says about the vital spiritual discipline of leading without recognition.
Okay.
The text challenges the reader to think about the most profound, impactful leaders in human history. Very often, if you look closely, the individuals who shaped those great leaders the most were completely invisible. They were anonymous parents, quiet mentors, Sunday school teachers, or steadfast friends who sought absolutely zero credit for their influence. The manuscript forces us to ask a terrifying but beautiful question. What if the greatest, most eternal leadership legacy you will ever leave is a quiet, hidden act of service that no one on earth will ever associate with your name?
That is a staggering thought to end on. It brings us right back to where we started. When you look at that traditional corporate ladder with its clean lines and its promise of an upward trajectory, it looks so precise and so appealing.
It does.
But if this manuscript is right, lasting human influence isn't found by climbing above people so you can look down on them. It's found by stepping completely off the ladder, getting your hands dirty, and becoming the foundation they stand on. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.